Hey guys, welcome to week 6 of your success skills class. You are going to receive 2 videos today, or you have received 2 videos today. In the first one, I'm going to cover chapter 4, which is taking tests. In chapter 7, in the next video, we are going to take a look at information competency and dealing with technology and things of that nature. So 2 pretty short and sweet chapters. What I've also included in your email, I want to just reiterate that in order for you to get credit for this week's class, since we're not actually in class, you need to, to show that you've watched this video, I need to receive the in-class activities that we're going to do today. So we're going to start this with one of our journal reflections that we typically do, and we'll do a couple other things in this, and you'll see them in the videos. And so what you can do as you guys go along with the video, you can probably best way to do it is just to pause the video and answer the questions as you kind of move along. And then you can do one of 2 things. I'm showing that as writing it down. You can either take a picture of it and send it to me via email, or you can type your answers out and send it to me via email that way. Either way, I have to receive these assignments before class next week in order to be able to mark you as attended for this week. And of course, for you guys to get that in-class activity credit in the grade book. So make sure you get those things completed by next class. So, and I'll mention that in the email, and I'll send you a text just to remind you guys so you all know that needs to take place. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys so you all can see as we follow along with our PowerPoint today. So I'll just be up here in the corner as we go through the PowerPoint. And like I said, you guys can pause and stop it along the way as you guys feel the need to. So in chapter 4, if you happen to be following along in your book, chapter 4 starts on page 82. So as you guys can see, we're going to talk about taking tests today. I know that you guys have all taken tests before. We've taken tests in our careers before ATA, and then also while we've been at ATA, we've taken many tests. In this chapter, we're going to take a look at just some different strategies to better our test-taking skills. So that's what we're going to take a look at here. So I want you guys to start with a journal reflection. I want you guys to take a look on page 84. You guys will see 5 questions, and I want you guys to just take a minute to answer those 5 questions to think about how you currently feel about tests. For those of you guys who do not have a textbook, I'll go ahead and read those questions to you guys. And again, feel free to just pause, when necessary, so you guys can answer those questions. Okay, so number 1 says, how do you feel about tests in general? That's it. Just tell me, how do you currently feel about tests? Number 2, what are your first memories of being in a testing situation, and what were your feelings and why? So think back to when you can first remember when you were taking a test. Our memory might go just so far, but maybe there's something that stands out in your mind. How did you feel during that time, and why did you feel that way? Maybe you remember it because it was something that stressed you out tremendously, or perhaps you remember it because of the situation you were in, and maybe the friends that were around you in 3rd grade, whatever that might be, that you can think back to as far as you can remember, think back to when you were in a testing situation. What were your feelings during that time, and why? Number 3, what makes a test good and bad from your perspective? So in your eyes, what would you consider to be a good test? And they put them in quotations. And again, good can mean that it's something that's easy. Good can mean that it is something that challenges you. Good can mean that it's something that covers the material exactly as your instructor covered it. Whatever it might be, from your perspective, what makes a test good? And on the opposite end, what makes a test bad? Just give me your opinion on that. Number 4. What factors contribute to your success or failure on a particular exam? So what is it that would make you successful, or what would it be that would make you not successful? And what of those factors are under your control? So obviously you guys might be thinking studying. Obviously studying as much as you can. If you obviously went a week without looking at your book or your notes, then obviously that is under your control, and it would probably contribute to your failure on a test. But perhaps maybe some factors could include the way that the instructor designs the test, and that might be out of your control. So some things that would contribute to your success and failure, and which one of those factors are under your control. And lastly, number five, what strategies do you use when taking tests to maximize your performance? Which of those have been particularly effective, and why? So perhaps you're the type of test taker who goes through and answers all the questions that they feel really comfortable with first, and then they utilize their time by going back to the end and spending a little bit more time on the ones they felt less comfortable with. Or perhaps maybe you're the type of person who just goes in order, and you just take your time. Maybe on multiple choice questions, you use process of elimination. Maybe you answer essay questions first to get those thoughts out of your head. There's all kinds of different ways and strategies and things that we're going to talk about as we go through the rest of this lecture. But tell me what you do right now. What are some things you think are pretty effective on test taking? When you're taking tests, and what are those things? Okay. So like I said, just take a minute to, again, pause and answer those questions. I'm going to go ahead and move forward. So hopefully you guys have had a chance to answer those. Okay. So tests in general, tests cause great anxiety for both students and for instructors. And you guys are thinking, how can they cause anxiety for instructors? Well, as instructors, we want to make sure that we are testing you on the things that you need to be tested on to make sure that you're going to become a successful nurse or coder or whatever program that we're teaching at the time. We want to make sure that you're going to be successful, so we're testing you on the appropriate things. So we need to make sure not only that you're tested on those things, but also so that we want to make sure that there are things that we've covered, things that we feel that you guys are going to do well on. There's all kinds of anxiety that goes into building tests as well. But then there's the anxiety that comes with taking the test. Did I study enough? Am I prepared? Are the things that the instructor talked about in class, are those going to be the things that are on the test? So there is a great deal of anxiety that comes with taking tests. And today we're going to talk about some different strategies and some things to hopefully overcome that anxiety. So tests are valuable. What they do is they help define what you know and what you still need to work on. And that's a key point there, because it talks about that in the very next bullet point. It says, don't allow tests to define your worth as a person. I'm going to go back to that second bullet point again, because why we shouldn't let these tests define our worth as a person is because they only help to define what you know and what you need to work on. But I should add to that, on that particular chapter alone. So for instance, let's say you have an anatomy test. Let's say maybe you probably could have done more to prepare for it, and on that anatomy test, you're tested on the endocrine system. The endocrine system can be tough. Maybe you don't do so well on the endocrine system. Do not, if you don't do well on it, do not let that test be something that tells yourself, and let it tell yourself that I'm not going to be a good nurse. I'm not going to be a great student. A lot of times that's what people do, is they, get one poor test score and they let it crush them for the rest of the quarter. Remember, that only says what you feel comfortable with on the endocrine system, but it tells you what you need to work on. What that tells you then is that's what, come time for the midterm or the final, that's something we need to really focus on, because we didn't do so well on the endocrine system. But the cardiovascular system, we knocked that one out of the park. So it doesn't mean that we're a bad anatomy student. It doesn't mean that we're a bad, future nurse or medical assistant or whatever. It simply means that we just need to work a little bit more on that subject. So that's the thing to remember with tests. They do not define who we are as a person. They only measure how well we studied Even if we studied really well, it's just how much we studied and how much we feel comfortable with that particular chapter. But also our test taking skills. So we're going to talk a little bit about those test taking skills and strategies through this class here. So our P in our POWER acronym, so prepare. So take a long-term view when preparing for tests. Obviously, tests are something, in order to be successful on them, you have to prepare. We talked about this when we covered memory. Memory was something that we really focused on. In order for you to have a great understanding of something, you have to study for it. You have to see that constant repetition in order for you to, to be able to put it into your own words and to fully understand. So that kind of goes along with this too, is we have to study. But before we even start studying, what are we preparing for? These are some things that are helpful in knowing ahead of time, because it could help us, with kind of getting an idea of what we're studying. So do we know what material will be covered? Obviously know what chapters are going to be on the test. Don't study chapter 7 when the test is on chapter 8. That'll obviously put you way behind. So know what material is going to be on the test. Knowing about how many questions will there be. Sometimes this is something that instructors may or may not feel comfortable giving you. Sometimes they want you to, kind of just prepare for whatever, whether it's a 10-question test or a 30-question test. Sometimes they don't want to give you that heads up. But a lot of times, it doesn't hurt to ask. So a lot of times they'll tell you about how long that is, and it just kind of gives you an idea of what to expect. Because there's nothing worse than sitting down thinking you're going to have a 10-question test, a short quiz, and then it's a 100-question test. And then you have that little bit of anxiety thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know if I was prepared for 100 questions. So even though you probably are, it sometimes causes a little bit of anxiety. So it's good to know ahead of time. How much time will you have to take it? This helps you to know, especially as you sit down to take that test, how to plan that out. We'll talk about different strategies for different types of test questions. One of the things I mentioned when we were talking about that journal reflection, we were talking about different things that you do on a test. I mentioned that one of those things might be that you go through and you answer all the questions that you feel comfortable with first. That's a great test strategy, especially when you're taking a timed test, because that timed test, again, you only have so much time on it. So you really don't want to go to number 1, answer it. Number 2, oh, I don't feel comfortable with that question. Sit here and think about it for a while. And then you spend 5 minutes on number 2, and now you're wasting that time. So the best thing to do is to go through all of the questions. Okay, let's skip number 2 and we'll come back. Go through to number 4, number 5, number 6. Actually, something in number 6 helps spark a memory. And now I remember number 2, and we might be able to go back to it. So you really want to utilize your time wisely. And the best way to do that is to go through and answer all the questions that you know first. Keep an eye on your time, but then you'll be able to spend more time at the end answering the ones you feel less comfortable with. You can spend more time on that then. So say if you have 60 minutes for a test, go through and answer questions you feel great about. You answer 40 questions that you feel comfortable with, and you've got, let's say, 20 more questions left. You can go through and spend a little bit more time. Again, there might be something that has sparked a memory for you, and something that can help. But you've got, let's say 45 minutes left on the test. You can spend more time on that now. The last thing you want is to go through and have spent time and maybe just guessing on some of the questions, when really some of the questions at the end would have been really easy to answer, and you run out of time and you miss your opportunity to answer those and have those guaranteed points. So remember that. So it's good to know how much time you'll have to take the test. And what kind of questions will there be on that test? Are they all multiple choice? Obviously, I can answer multiple choice questions pretty quickly. Same thing with true, false, and with matching. But short answer, essay, fill in the blank type questions, maybe we'll spend a little bit more time, especially on essay questions, because essay questions are typically a paragraph or 2 that you will be required to write. And so that's going to take a little bit more time. So going along with how much time we have on a test, knowing the type of test questions will be good to know in advance too. So with that, so you want to match your preparation to the type of test you're studying for. Remember, essay questions are more big picture questions. As you're going through and you're studying, go through it, and as you're looking, you're maybe not sure exactly what the essay questions are going to be on your test, but you maybe go through and you see a lot of key terms. Okay, key terms are probably not going to be essay questions on a test. Those are just kind of, just terms, so they don't, require you to think more about it. Essay questions involve the comparison of things, or a description of something, or sometimes a compare and contrast, so knowing the opposites, or sometimes writing out a process. So perhaps you're studying and you think, wow, that would be a really good essay question. Make sure you focus on that, because it very well could be your essay question. So know facts, know how those facts are connected though. Sometimes that's the type of question that's going to be asked for essays. Imagine those questions as you're studying. Imagine those questions that your instructor will ask. Short answer and fill in, be able to recall information, study specific and very detailed information. With multiple choice and true, false, and matching. So pay attention to detail rather than looking at the whole spectrum. So looking at a big picture, you must know a lot of facts. These are great things to use index cards for. So your key terms and those things. So make sure we're studying those as we're going through and reading our notes and our text. A great way to prepare for a test is to test yourself, especially for those with test anxiety. With test anxiety, sometimes we're prepared for it, we've studied, we feel comfortable with it, but then we sit down and we get that test in front of us and we just panic. So the best thing to do is to put yourself as much as you can in that test situation, and then it makes the actual test situation something that you're kind of used to. What I mean by that, go home, or maybe, when you're studying, create some sample test questions. Maybe take questions from the textbook website, from the back of your book, create your own, ask the instructor for some sample questions. Sometimes that may or may not happen. Or take a practice test with a study group. Maybe ask a friend to create some test questions. Then, maybe when you're creating your own test questions, it's easy to answer those right away because we've created it from something we've probably just read. So if you're creating your own test questions, I recommend creating those and coming back a couple days later to answer them. But if you're in a study group, that's a fantastic way to study or to create a test, because you don't know what's coming, just the same way you would if you were taking an instructor's test. But what you can do, put notes away, put books away, and again, put yourself in that actual test situation. Time yourself. Again, it may not be a full test. You may only have created 10 sample questions, but give yourself only 5 or 10 minutes to finish those 10 questions and see how well you do. If your friend has created these test questions, perhaps maybe have them check your work and see how you did. But then when you put yourself in that test situation, again, you're preparing yourself for that so that it's less shocking when you get into it in an actual test situation. Even though we know we're not taking an actual test, it's easy for us to sit there and go, okay, this isn't a real test. But again, you're putting your mind in that presence, in that mind frame, I should say, to prepare yourself for that. And it's just a great way to practice. I mean, the expression practice makes perfect. And that's very, very true for a lot of things. And that comes with tests too. That practicing, the more we practice for tests, the better we become at test taking. So let's think about test anxiety for a second. That's a big thing I've mentioned a couple times as we've gone through lecture, is this test anxiety. Let's think about whether or not we have it. So I want you guys to take a look at the questions on page 88. It's a series of 10 questions. So what you can do is you can just, instead of numbering your sheet 1 to 10, what's going to happen is only a couple of these phrases may pertain to you. So on the same sheet you use for your journal, I just want you to write down the numbers that you would check off on this list. So meaning of the 10 questions, maybe only numbers 2, 3, 5, and 7 pertain to you. So you would just write down 2, 3, 5, and 7. So you can take a second, go ahead and pause and read those questions. And then again, just write down the numbers that pertain to you. For those of you guys who don't have your text, I'll go ahead and read through these 10 phrases here. So number one, the closer a test date approaches, the more nervous that I get. The closer a test date approaches, the more nervous I get. Is that true for you? The closer that we get, do I start getting a little bit more panicky? Number two, I am sometimes unable to sleep on the night before a test. I would say that's probably pretty common. You kind of are freaking out a little bit about it, especially if you're cramming the night before. That'll definitely do it to you. Number three, I have, quote, frozen up during a test, finding myself unable to think or respond. Did you find when the test was handed in front of you that you just went blank? That's what that means by freezing up. Number four, I can feel my hands shaking as I pick up my pencil to begin a test. So are you actually physically shaking? That could be a little bit more of an extreme end of test anxiety, but sometimes it happens. Number five, the minute I read a tough question, all the facts I ever knew about that subject abandon me and I can't get them back no matter how hard I try. So the second you read a tough question, do you immediately forget everything else? Number six, I have become physically ill before or during a test. That's, again, probably more so on the extreme end. Number seven, nervousness prevents me from studying immediately before a test. So maybe you're so nervous you really just cannot pick up your notes or your text. This happened to me all the time. Number eight, I often dream about an upcoming test. So maybe you're thinking about it so much that it even shows up in your dreams. Number nine, even if I successfully answer a number of questions, my anxiety stays with me throughout the test. So even though you're answering questions correctly and you feel confident with it, you know that is something that, is okay. I feel good with these. But even so, your test anxiety is still there. And lastly, number 10, I am reluctant to turn in my test paper for fear that I can do better if I continue to work on it. So maybe you go to hand in that paper and you're just like, I don't want to. And I've seen that happen many, many times, but that's part of that test anxiety. So again, down at the bottom it does state, did you write down more than 4? If so, you have experienced some test anxiety. It does indicate that, in particular, the statements number 3, which is the freezing up, number 5, the minute you read a tough question, you instantly forget everything, number 6, that you've become physically ill, number 7, nervousness prevents me from even picking up a book, and number 10, I'm reluctant to turn in my test before or thinking I could do better. Those particular statements may indicate some pretty serious test anxiety. So what we're going to take a look at here is let's get through having to deal with test anxiety. What are some things we can do in the preparation stages to help to avoid this? So 1, prepare thoroughly. Especially for those with test anxiety, the number 1 thing you can do is just prepare, is get ready as much as you can, study as much as you can, get it to the point where you just know, you feel confident. This is just another thing. Obviously, if I tested you all today on how to, add whole numbers, 5 plus 3, 2 plus 7. If I told you that that was what the test was on, you would feel very confident about that. So test anxiety, again, doesn't even come into play there, because those are things that I have seen through my entire life. I have practiced and practiced and practiced, and over the years, I've learned, since we were, in first grade, learned how to add, and now I can do it with confidence. So the more we prepare, the more we practice, the better we become at something. And so that's what we have to do in these types of situations too. Prepare as thoroughly as possible, and that's going to help us to overcome that anxiety. Take a realistic view of that test. So tell yourself, remember, as we talked about at the very beginning, this is not going to determine whether or not I become a nurse. This test is only on the nervous system. You know, so take a realistic view of it. Remember that all of your tests for a quarter are averaged all together. So if you don't do so great on a test, you know, your average can be pulled up along with your assignments and everything else that goes into a class. But look at it from that perspective, that it's not going to make or break who you are as a person. It's just who you've, you know, what you've prepared for on this subject, and you feel good, you know, really kind of look at that, you know, positive light and tell yourself that I'm prepared, I know what I'm doing. Be very realistic here. Make sure you eat right and get enough sleep. Be careful with caffeine. Sometimes where anxiety makes us feel a little bit jittery, so caffeine can make us feel even more jittery, and that sometimes takes that away. If we don't get enough sleep, same thing. The last thing we want is to feel either sleepy or, again, jittery because of our lack of sleep. So make sure you're eating right and getting enough sleep to make sure that that, you know, takes, you know, an account for that too. Learn relaxation techniques. You know, there's nothing wrong with sitting there before a test. You know, if you have test anxiety, that doesn't mean sit down and go through your notes last minute. That's only going to make you more anxious. You know, you've prepared all week. I feel good. I feel confident. So just sit there and breathe. Practice your breathing and just breathe deeply. And then even when the test is handed to you, breathe the same way. And try to, you know, make sure you're just forcing yourself to be relaxed, as then it will then happen. Visualize success. So, sounds silly, but, you know, for those of us that maybe when we were younger and we played sports, I just remember, I always relate this to sports because I played sports growing up, and I was always told to, you know, picture yourself hitting the ball. You know, I was playing softball. You know, picture yourself, you know, hitting that shot. And it was something that I felt like, I was like, what? But the more you built up your confidence, the better you felt at it and the better you became at it. And, you know, and it was just something that became so true. So the more you tell yourself that you've got this, you know, and that you visualize, you know, getting an A on this test, you visualize those, you know, those positive steps, the more likely they are to happen. We've talked about this earlier in the quarter. We've discussed how negative thoughts can sometimes get in the way, and they really do. They become kind of a physical barrier for your success. So visualize that, you know, visualize that positive, you know, goal and that success that's happening there on that test. So imagine that you get an A on this test, you feel confident, you feel great. The more you picture that, the more likely it's going to happen. If absolutely need be, if you are one of those that experiences the extreme stress, the stress from that test anxiety, then maybe consider talking to someone about it. So feel free to reach out to Student Services. If this is something that, you know, we may be able to help you with, reach out to your instructors, whoever may be able to help. Talking to someone will help for sure. Another way to prepare, as I mentioned with testing yourself, that was something that we talked about. We brought up study groups. Study groups are super, super awesome. They're super helpful. I cannot stress that enough, that the more you have, not only because you have support around you, you've got, you know, people just helping to build up your confidence and to you know, to help push you along the way, but you also have that kind of that, I'm trying to think of the word that I'm looking for here. You've got somebody depending on you. The same thing goes for a workout partner. If you have somebody that is depending on you to show up at the gym, the more likely you are to show up at the gym, because you know that your friend is there waiting for you. And okay, I can't bail this time because it's not like it's just me. If it was just me going to the gym, I'd go, I'll go tomorrow. But I know that Sarah's waiting on me, so I'll just go. I'll go. And then you show up, you have a great workout, you feel fantastic. And you've got that friendship that helps to bring up your serotonin levels and your happiness just by being there with your friend. And the same thing goes for study groups. I know that sounds crazy, but you're there to push each other. You're there to, you know, create tests for one another, to quiz each other. There's nothing better than putting more minds together. 2 heads are better than 1, they always say. 3, 4, 5 would be even better, because you took one thing from lecture, a friend took another thing from lecture. Let's put those together, and now we've got just this awesome, just endless supply of information in our brain because we've got everybody talking about this and working together. So this is going to help members of a group organize and structure their material, so the things that they need for the test and their notes. Members can share their different perspectives on that material, so like I just mentioned. It prevents members from overlooking really important information. It's real easy when I'm by myself to just be going through my notes and going through my text and saying, okay, yeah, I think that's probably what's going to be the most important thing. But when you show up to a study group and somebody says, well, to me, I think this is probably pretty important, so we should probably focus on this too. And it keeps you from overlooking that. It forces members to rethink that material by explaining it to other members of the group. And it motivates members to do their best. So it really helps to push you and, like I said, to motivate you the same way it would when you have a friend, waiting to work out with you. It's going to motivate you and push you to just move forward. And that's the idea there. So study groups are always a good idea. The only thing I'll suggest with study groups, so going back to that, the only thing I'll suggest with study groups is make sure you're very focused on that study group. If you decide to meet at, say, a library or a coffee shop or even an empty classroom at ATA, and everybody in the study group has a particular window of time, make sure that you're very focused on getting things accomplished. Don't talk about what you're going to do this weekend. Don't talk about how I can't believe that this instructor did this and didn't do this, and you spend too much time complaining, then you're really not getting anything done. So be careful with how you utilize your time in that study group, making sure that you're very focused, talking about the things that you think will be on a test and the things we need to study for, and helping one another out. So you may feel good about something and you can teach that to the group, or somebody else may be able to teach you something else. So it's really, really helpful. So again, like I said, just kind of be careful with how we utilize that time. So our O in our POWER acronym, again, is organize. So make sure when we're getting organized that we're bringing the right tools together. So, on the day of the test, if you're allowed a note card, obviously don't forget that note card. If it's something that's timed and you're not sure if the classroom has a clock in it, you really need to watch your time, I'd definitely wear a watch so you yourself can monitor that time. So when the test is handed out to you, if your instructor says you've got 1 hour, okay, it's 9:16. I have till 10:16. Keep an eye on that watch. Bring notes and text if permitted. So like I said, if your instructor allows you a note card or a calculator or anything, if there's something permitted, make sure you bring that. I always say make sure you bring that just in case. I'll tell you, I've done it before in some of my classes where, like on the day of the final, students are coming in to take a test and they know they get to leave after because it's the final. So they come in with just something to write with. But I'll, 20 minutes in say, okay, guys, you have 10 minutes to use your notes in your books. And then people look around and they go, well, we don't have our books. Should have brought them. But that's just something that, if allowed, you may know ahead of time, but even if you don't, it's always good to have those things just in case. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's always good to have those things just in case. Always avoid comparing study preparation with fellow students on the day of the test, especially, again, with that test anxiety. If you roll into class and somebody next to you says, wow, I studied for like 5 hours yesterday and I was up all night, and then you're in the back of your head going, well, I didn't do that. Should I have done that? Am I prepared for the test now? The last thing you want to do is compare that. Everybody has different study strategies, and maybe cramming works for that student. I definitely don't suggest it. It's never worked for me, and I think that's probably rare when cramming at the last minute works, but maybe it does. And maybe if you've prepared throughout the week, again, just tell yourself that you've prepared for this and you've got this. Don't worry about how other students have prepared themselves. Listen to what your instructor says before the test is handed out. Oftentimes, this is very valuable information. Sometimes there's something an instructor says, like I've done it before where I've handed out a test and said, okay, guys, on the back of that sheet, what I'm looking for here is this. Maybe it's hard to understand. I want to make sure that they understand it. But some students who weren't paying attention don't know how to answer the question correctly because they weren't listening. So making sure that you're listening to your instructor. There's a reason why they're saying something right before a test, I promise. Our work and our POWER acronym, so our W here, so take a deep breath. While this test is happening, again, practice that breathing, make sure you're not stressing out, tell yourself you're gonna do your best, and that's okay. Making sure you're reading the test instructions carefully too. So not just listening to what the instructor has to say, but there are important details in the instructions too. On my math test, I know I've given before, for instance, the details are in, math, where I'll say, okay, you just have to simplify this. You do not solve it completely. Or on a fractions test, for instance, I will say, okay, guys, on the fractions question, or it'll say in the instructions, it'll say, answer the following fractions questions, be sure to reduce your answers. If you don't reduce the answer, you're going to get the answer wrong. So you want to make sure you're reading the test instructions very carefully too. Like I mentioned before, answer all the easy questions first and then go back to the ones that were a little bit more difficult. If it's something that's an essay type question, make sure you're writing very, very legibly and only on one side of the paper. Most of the time on a test, if you have an essay question, they leave enough space, but if your essay is to provide a separate sheet of paper, my advice would be to write on just one side of the paper, because if you write on both, sometimes it bleeds through, or sometimes it's hard to read because of how the pen was pressed onto the paper, and it's just hard to read the other side. So just as long as you're writing very clearly so that you know the instructor can read what you've written down. Be careful with things that use Scantrons, like I think there's a handful of teachers that use Scantrons pretty often. So anything that's going to be graded by a machine, make sure you're being very careful with bubbling in the circles to make sure you're not going outside of the circle or you're filling it in completely. And with online exams, be prepared for possible technical difficulties, but remember that your instructors will work with you. They understand technical difficulties, so it's nothing to panic over. If you're experiencing the technical difficulty, chances are somebody else is too. So don't stress. So getting into the different types of questions with our work. So I just mentioned with essay questions, again, making sure we're writing very legibly, but also make sure we're paying attention to specifically what is being asked. Write out an outline if we need to on a scrap piece of paper so that you can organize your thoughts on how you want to write that essay. Sometimes it's tough to start writing that essay and then think, oh man, that would have sounded better if it were up here or down here, and it's just kind of tough. So maybe scratching out some of the things that you might find, scratching on a piece of paper how you would want to organize that, and that makes it a little bit easier to then go ahead and then write it out. Make sure you're brief and to the point. The last thing an instructor wants to be reading is just a rambling on of nothing that has anything to do with the question. So be brief and to the point, move from major points to minor ones, but making sure you're answering every single part of the question. Some common essay type questions are in your text on page 97. If you're taking a look at this, there's some things like I had mentioned earlier. Compare and contrast is a common essay type question where it asks you to compare the similarities and the differences between two or more things. Illustrate. If you see the term illustrate, it means to provide examples, show instances. If you need to prove something, very similar, it says to take something that the instructor wants you to prove, but show evidence, arguments, convince the person who's reading this what you're trying to prove. To define. So again, to just write out the meaning. So there's lots of different types of essay questions, and there's just a handful of those and some things to, prepare for. Short answer and fill-ins, these are a lot different than essays. Essays are typically a paragraph or two as you're defining something or, again, comparing something, whatever it might be. These are going to be more brief, really brief. Short answers are typically 1 to 2 sentences. Fill in the blanks are usually just 1 or 2 words. And so really, really brief. Multiple choice, obviously we know multiple choice. There's just one, if we're given 4 choices, one of those are the answer. Be careful, or one of those is the answer, I should say. Be careful, watch out for those multiple choice questions that say answer all that apply. That's a really common one for you nurses. When it says answer all that apply, it means that there may be more than one correct answer. Also be careful with another one with the nurses. I'm thinking of like NCLEX style questions. Oftentimes, on the multiple choice, a lot of the choices are correct. Letter A might be correct, letter B might be correct, and even letter C might be correct. But the question may state, answer the one that's more correct. I know that sounds crazy, but NCLEX style questions oftentimes do that because it's looking for, it's giving you different scenarios, and only one of those is the best possible scenario. And that's something based on what you've studied, so watch out for those too. Be sure of the number of answers you can choose. So like I said, watch out for the all that apply. Answer the question in your head first. That's the best thing to do with a multiple choice question. Read the question before you even read the answer choices. Sometimes those answer choices might throw you off, but before you even read those choices, answer it in your head, because now you know exactly what you're looking for. Look for that. If you can't answer it in your head first, then that's when we can use the process of elimination. So look for absolutes as possibilities to discard. Sometimes that happens in true-false questions, where an absolute would be like a statement that says, this never happens, but it does happen sometimes. So because of that, the statement that says never would be something that you can eliminate as a possible correct answer. Break the question apart. So think about, okay, what's being asked of me here? So look at it in different sections, in different pieces. And then use an educated guess strategy. If push comes to shove, then we know that there are some that are definitely wrong, so we can cross those out. And so which one would sound better of the last 2 or 3 that you're left with? So that's a great strategy for those multiple choice questions, is to, definitely eliminate the ones that are wrong, but now you're just down to a couple things. And again, remember, you can always come back to it, and you might find something later in the test that might help you to answer that question. With true false, answer the ones that you're sure about first. Like I said in the previous slide, consider absolutes because they will determine the answer. Like I said, things like never and always are real popular ones that are absolutes that say that this is always the case, when really that might not be true. So that indicates a false statement. If part of the statement is false, then the entire statement is false. Keep that in mind. With matching, very similar to all of our questions, make sure you go through and match the ones that you know first, and now you're just left with a couple, and it's easier to kind of play that educated guess strategy and know that, oh, well, that's, you can think I'm only down to these 3. Oh, well, that one definitely is that one. It's easier for you to think about when you're down with just a couple. And always keep academic honesty a priority. So always remembering academic honesty, guys, remember, is making sure you're always being honest on a test, that you're using your own work. You're not looking over your shoulder, or looking over, not your shoulder, but you're not looking over on somebody else's tests. Obviously, you want to do your own work. That's the importance of academic honesty, is to make sure that we're not cheating. That's a big thing. And we talked about that at the very beginning. Obviously, there are consequences for cheating, but also we don't learn anything when we're cheating. So we want to stay away from that. So our E in our POWER acronym, so evaluate. So save time at the end of that test to evaluate your work, to go back and see, okay, how do I feel like I did, on that test? Check for any obvious mistakes. So go back, and anything that, oh, I forgot to answer this one, that's a big deal. That's something that's really obvious. You reread it, and you think, oh my gosh, that's definitely not the answer. But if you go back and read certain questions and you say, it could be that other one, don't touch that. The answer that you went with at the beginning is probably the right answer, but it's real easy at the end of a test to go back and think, but it could be this answer. So be careful with that. Again, only change the obvious mistakes, ones that are definitely not right. Proofread your essays and short answers. Make sure they sound okay. Make sure you're using correct grammar, the correct punctuation, making sure that it looks great and it's legible for the instructor when they're reading that. Add any other additional information and attempt any questions that you weren't sure about earlier in the test. Something to also evaluate, did you run out of time on that test? So stop and plan a quick strategy for the final minutes of that test. If you know that you're coming down to the end and you still have 10 more questions left and you only have 2 minutes, it's time to start guessing. We want to make sure that, again, remember that something is better than nothing, so it's time to start putting some things down. So plan that quick strategy. On essays, just at least answer the question. That's a big thing. You may not have time to, really think about it and write it out as carefully as you would have if you didn't, or if you had more time. But make sure that we're using the appropriate keywords and we're at least answering the question. Again, something is always better than nothing on a test. So our rethink. So how did you do? Think just beyond your score, or just beyond, think beyond just your score. That's funny how that was worded. Meaning that, remember, okay, I got an 85. That's a great score. But do I feel really confident with this? Should I still go back and re-look at it and say, absolutely. Remember that there's a midterm, there's a final on this information. You want to make sure you do well on that. So think beyond just that score. Examine any mistakes for how to do better in the future. Things that you can study, things that, okay, I did great on this, I did great on this, I didn't do so great on this question, so maybe that's something you need to, really focus on. Or maybe it's the type of test question itself, and you need to prepare for those types of test questions. Or perhaps it's your studying strategy and your preparation. So think how you can do better in the future based on your score or based on that test. Actively listen to what your instructor says about the test. When they're handing back the test, sometimes there might be some key information on what they said or what they say. They may say, or what they thought about the test, I should say. They may be handing back the test and say, hey guys, on this section, I saw a lot of errors. I saw a lot of people doing this. Remember that you need to do this in that. I'm using math as an example. So in that calculation, don't forget that this needs to be brought into that formula. Whatever it might be, they may be telling you ways that you can study to prepare for your next test on that information. Were your errors based on not understanding that material or due to your test-taking skills? So as I mentioned before, that's something to think about with our preparation strategy. Are we studying the way that we should be to preparing for these tests? Is it that we ran out of time and we're not really great with time management during tests and we need to practice with that? Or again, is it just the material on that particular test that we have a hard time with? And follow up with your instructor if need be. Sometimes your instructor can have some valuable information for you. They may be able to give you some tips and some pointers for you to help you with your next test. All right, guys. So that is chapter 4. So we had 2 activities from chapter 4, but hang on to that. If you're writing these down or if you're typing that up, we've got one more chapter this week, and there will be an activity in that chapter. So you want to go ahead and move on to that video.